Good morning, our listeners, for our first Family Voice Zoom session for 2023. My name's Andrew McColl. I'm the Queensland Director of Family Voice. Today, we're talking to Professor Patrick Parkinson on the subject, Transgender, the Truth and the Lies. And I'll just introduce the subject for a moment. The destructive subject of transgender continues to bother the community, and our state governments seem predisposed to surrender to its proponents' claims, despite its anti-science, anti-life and anti-human assertions. We're hoping Professor Patrick Parkinson will shed some light on the meaning and implications of transgender so we can more effectively confront and destroy its evil agenda. So Patrick has been a member of the New South Wales Child Protection Council. He served from 2004 to 2007 as Chairperson of the Family Law Council, and also chaired a review of the Child Support Scheme in 2004 to 2005. He was President of the International Society of Family Law from 2011 to 2014, and Dean of Law at the T.C. Burns School of Law from 2018 to 2021. He's the Executive Director of a new Christian organisation, Publica, that's www.publica.org.au, concerned with strengthening families and communities in a post-Christian society. He also works with churches on child protection and religious freedom issues. Good morning to you, Professor Patrick Parkinson.
Good morning, Andrew. Good to join you.
Thanks. Professor Parkinson, your professional background has been in family law and child protection. Why is it that we find ourselves today confronting things like transgender?
Well, it's a really good question, Andrew. And 10 years ago, would any of us have thought we'd be talking now about these issues, talking about males going into women's changing rooms with the full authority of the government behind them? A lot of the stuff which is going on now was unthinkable even 5 years ago. Now, what is going on? I think there's two answers to the question. The first one is a medical answer, and the second one is an ideological answer. And I don't think you can discuss this fairly and reasonably without understanding the medical at least first, okay? That there's always been, for a long, long time, a small number of people, minute number of people, who have felt they were born in the wrong body, who had years and years, decades of distress about that. Almost entirely male, not entirely, but 3 times to 5 times as many males as females had this problem. And they were talking about it as being born in the wrong body, and that was a way of trying to express what they were feeling. For some of those men, it was a sexual thing. There's a condition called autogenophilia, which is where you get sexually excited by thinking yourselves as the other sex. And we've known people who cross-dress, for example. We've lived with this in the community for a very long time, but it was a very small number. And out of that small number has come, I think, an ideological movement, which is really saying, I can be whatever I want to be. And it's fighting against the last barriers to self-determination and autonomy. I can even change sex. And there is nothing that can restrain me from fulfilling my purpose and sense of happiness. And so what we see now is quite a big movement, which is, in a sense, the final sort of phase of the sexual revolution, very opposed to any boundaries, anybody telling me I can't be what I want to be. And this is why there's really quite a battle, I think, between the Christian community and this movement, because it's a movement which fights against any barriers, and the ultimate barrier is that I was born male or I was born female.
Yes, well, that seems to take us back to the whole story of Genesis 1, doesn't it? And perhaps we can go back to that for a moment, We know that God described our creation specifically as male and female, that is the Adam and Eve, meaning that we have the capacity for marriage, and with that, the capacity for the division of labor in marriage and children. God explained that it is not good for the man to be alone. I will make him a helper suitable for him. That's in Genesis 2, verse 18. And Jesus explained later in the gospel, so they are no longer two but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. And this shows us that he tells us about ourselves and his plan for us in that. So the marriage of the man and the woman gives us a new family with the capacity for children, and it glorifies God. So consequently, every attempt at substituting for this is simply a fraud, a perversion, and sin. So the notion that a 15-year-old person, or actually anyone, can change from one sex to another is clearly a lie, isn't it?
I don't use the word lie. I don't use the word sin in this context, but it's a grave mistake. And I'd want to put it just in those more neutral terms.
Right.
Let's get into this a little bit more, because of course, the vast majority of all babies are born male or female. Now, there is a small number, again, a tiny, tiny number, maybe as little as 1 in 50,000 babies who are born with ambiguous genitalia. There are more who have some abnormalities of chromosomes called, or other issues medically, which we call disorders of sexual development, but they are not, they don't cease to be either a boy or a girl. There's just more difficulty around identifying their sex, and that can be remediated to some extent by surgery and so on. We define sex in terms of reproductive function, and even those people who are affected by disorders of sex development either have a male reproductive capacity or a female reproductive capacity. So even if there are issues around the chromosomes, you have XXY rather than just XY, they are identifiably male or female. And the fact that there are abnormalities or differences in the human species doesn't mean there's a new third gender. So yes, God has created us male and female, and no, you cannot change sex. What you can do is to make modifications to your body that give you more of an appearance of the other sex, that allow you to pass, is the word that they often use, to pass as male or pass as female. Actually, females can pass as male quite well because they take testosterone, their voices deepen, they grow beards. If they have a double mastectomy, and this is all tragic, but if they do, then their chests are flat and they can appear to be quite male, but they're still capable of pregnancy in some cases. They are still female in terms of chromosomes and anatomy and so on. So that's what's going on. And the important thing to understand is that those medical steps people take to pass as the other sex are not without huge risks. If you are a female and you take testosterone, if you take if you start with puberty blockers, as some of the younger ones do, it will very likely destroy your fertility. It will very likely destroy your sexual function, or at least severely limit it. It will very likely affect your long-term medical health. There are cardiac problems. There are bone density problems coming from puberty blockers. So we've been sold this idea that the medical pathway on which so many young people are now on is risk-free, that it's not a big issue. It is. It's huge. And these changes are, for many, irreversible. So no, Andrew, you can't change sex. You can change the appearance of it. And as I say, you know, there have been men all through the years who have had this very profound problem that they've felt could only be addressed by trying to go through as much surgery as they can to change their bodies, but fundamentally their chromosomes remain the same.
Okay, so do we think then that there have been ethical gaps that have appeared in the training of doctors and other health professionals, so that, well, it used to be that we used to have this idea from Hippocratic Oath that we would do the patient no harm. Does it appear that that is no longer applicable in Western society?
I think it's saying that's going too far, but what is happening, and it is very concerning, is that there are people gripped with a belief that what they're doing is really good. They don't think they're doing harm, quite the opposite. And the whole sort of mantra is we're saving kids from suicide. Now, those suicide statistics are grossly exaggerated. There is a higher suicide rate, definitely, amongst teens and adults who have a transgender identification, no doubt about that. But those people typically have a lot of other mental health issues. And so if you look at the suicide rates amongst people with severe mental health problems, and you look at those who have transgender issues, you're going to see similar suicide rates. So it's very sad. Right. It's very sad, but it's you know, the idea that going down this medical pathway is going to save people from suicide isn't borne out by the majority of the evidence. Suicide rates tragically are still very high in that group. So people think that they're doing a world of good. And what I think is very concerning, because I've been close to this issue now for about 7 years, and I've been reading the medical literature, and I've been talking to doctors and psychiatrists about all of this. And what's really concerning is that there's now a mountain of evidence that there are significant risks to these medical procedures. And I think doctors are putting their heads in the sand. They are simply not prepared to look at the adverse evidence, to the challenges that we have made, other people have made to the suicide statistics, which just aren't borne out. The issues around puberty blockers, the issues around cross-sex hormones, the issues around autism. All of these issues are coming out now. And I think there are some doctors who irresponsibly are peddling nonsense and refusing to acknowledge the evidence which is emerging. Not least that young women are now deeply regretting what they have done.
Yeah, I suppose, you know, going back to my earlier question, Patrick, it seems to me to be such a horrific thing to do for a patient, say a 14-year-old girl with her mother or father, come into the doctor and she wants to have some kind of surgery, whether it's the breast removed or whatever. And for a sensible, sane, competent doctor to be confronted with a perfectly healthy 14 or 15-year-old girl with no health problems, and to kind of glibly acknowledge, oh, well, if that's how you feel, well, we can go ahead with puberty blockers or a mastectomy. It seems to me to be such a gross, what's the word, kind of walking away from responsibility for that child.
I think it's worse than that.
Right.
Because these are not kids coming without health problems. They have huge health problems, many of them, huge problems with body dysmorphia, as we call it, discomfort with their bodies, with anorexia in terms of some girls, with depression, with, as I said, a large number of these kids are on the autism spectrum. Studies vary, but up to a third of the kids in some of these gender clinics are on the autism spectrum. The rates of autism in this group are 10 times as high as in the population. So these kids have a lot of problems. They have mental health issues, they have neurobiological disorders. And what is so concerning is that I think some doctors are not asking the questions they should be asking, which is, now, with all these other problems, family dysfunction, adverse childhood experiences, sometimes child abuse, why is this child identifying as transgender or non-binary or whatever they are? And it's that lack of exploration of the origins of their problems, which I think is so concerning. and raises issues about the competence and ethics of the doctors concerned.
Right.
We've got to explore, why are kids coming with this belief? What's going on in their lives? And if you dig down, you'll find a lot of the problems I've talked about. Family dysfunction, adverse childhood experiences, other sorts of grief and loss. And it's very easy then to think that if only I change my body, that will solve all these other problems.
Right.
But then it doesn't.
Yeah.
And it doesn't.
And just that term transgender, I mean, trans, normally means a cross. But we know, as you're saying, that we know that a girl can't become a boy. She can't become a father in years to come. No. So even the term transgender is not really that applicable at all, is it?
It's not, and you know, as I say, there long have been those who would like, as far as possible, to make that transition, and I feel a great deal of empathy for them. Caitlin McGregor is a well-known figure, you know, had a long military background and then felt in her midlife she needed to make this change, and there are others as well. For whom this is an oppressive condition that they have, and which could possibly have some hormonal or genetic explanation for it. Possibly, right. we just don't know. But fundamentally, all they can do is try to pass as being the other sex, not actually become the other sex. So that is confused in the language and the, you know, the claims trans women are women or trans men are men. Well, no, they're not and cannot be, much as they would like to be.
Yeah. So what sort of oversight do doctors have today that you know, gives them some instruction insofar as these issues are concerned? Don't we have APRA overseeing how doctors treat patients, and is there anything coming from them?
No, there isn't. And I think one of the problems is that so many in the medical profession are captured by this. So what happens, it's happened in Australia, it's happened in America, it's happened elsewhere, is that groups like the Medical Association, Australian Medical Association, or the Australian Psychological Association, or psychiatrists, all these bodies, when they're asked to produce a position paper, they tend to give that to a committee which has a very strong component of LGBT advocacy. It may well be the LGBT committee of the AMA or the Psychologists Association or the Psychiatrists, you can see. So they come out and say, no, this is regular medicine, it's approved, it's safe, there are no risks and so on, or the risks can be managed. So these treatments become accepted by the professional bodies. And the problem is the other way, that people who challenge them might have complaints made against them to APRA, and I've known people who have had. So there's a big problem with the professional associations being captured by interest groups.
Okay, so then you've got a challenge coming where the professionalism of the medical fraternity becomes compromised. Yes,
and of course there are many doctors who will go nowhere near this stuff. There's a pediatrician who's been very public in Queensland, Gillian Wilson, saying, I will not refer kids to the gender clinic. So you've got the vast majority probably of the medical profession acting responsibly and sensibly, but in the public hospitals, there are gender clinics, there are private practitioners, GPs, who are dispensing these medications. And of course, teenagers and young adults who want to go down this pathway find these doctors and will get, in many or most cases, the medication they ask for from them.
So does that really mean, Patrick, that the family has kind of been subverted in healthcare, so that the cares and concerns of parents towards their child can be effectively overruled?
Partially yes and partially no. So a decision was reached in 2021 in the family court, a case called Ray Imogen number 6. And what it said was, and it was a friend of mine, as it happens, who was the judge, who I think, did a really good job with this case. He said, if the parents cannot agree either on the diagnosis of gender dysphoria or the treatment plan, or whether the child is competent to give their own consent, on any of those three issues, the parents are not in agreement, then the approval of the court is needed.
Right.
And it has to be taken to the court. And I've been involved in a very big case fairly recently, where that was the issue. The parents couldn't agree, and we were involved in taking the matter to court. And there are a number of other cases running at the moment in the family law system where these issues are being canvassed in the courts. So the law at the moment is quite protective as long as one of the parents is saying, no, I'm not going there. But parents come under enormous pressure, are told that the kids will suicide. The kids very often really, really, really want this. So you're battling your own child on this.
Right.
And that's really, really difficult. And they may come under pressure from the child protection services. This has happened elsewhere, where the child protection services say, well, you're not being responsible parents if you don't consent to this treatment. So I don't think the law has vitiated parental authority yet. Right up until the age of 18, that one of them has a veto. But my word, they come under pressure to give that consent.
Okay. So what do we think, though, Patrick, about the influence of social media with teenage children?
It's huge. It's huge. And again, there's been this desire to deny it. Anybody who said there's a social contagion in all of this is vilified on social media or the press. When I said this to a parliamentary inquiry in Queensland a couple of years ago, it was published and reported in the Australia, and then there was complaint to the Press Council, complaints to the university. But look, what's going on? There's a mixture of education and social media. So the education system, again, captured by this ideology in many cases. The Safe Schools movement, which began in Victoria, has been peddling this stuff for about 7 to 8 years now. Saying to kids, oh, you've got to explore your gender identity. You may not be a boy, you may not be a girl, you may be non-binary, you may be something else. And so you've got this amazing focus on gender identity, even in primary school. Do you know, I was just talking, as one does, yesterday to the hairdresser. So always a good way to sort of find out what people in the general community are thinking. And she said, in my local primary school where my daughter is, it's a small school, there are 5 kids who are saying they are transgender. So it's coming through the education system, causing a lot of confusion to young people. But then it's coming through social media with YouTube videos and so on, presenting a very attractive view of what it's like to be transgender. It's exciting. It gives you a sense of community, gives you a sense of specialness. Being lesbian these days, it's all ho-hum. Now, if you really want to be at the vanguard of progressive change, you are non-binary. And so this is just going through our teenage population. Ask any teacher, they will tell you in their high schools that this is all the buzz. Look, Andrew, sometimes it's harmless. If somebody's 14-year-old daughter says she's non-binary this month, agender next month, and something else the following month, suck it up. As long as she doesn't do anything about it, it will be a phase which will pass. But unfortunately, a lot of these kids are doing things about it.
Right.
And for a while, they get an incredible sense of acceptance from the online community, from the LGBT groups. They're loved. They feel special. And then they go down a pathway that many will later deeply regret. That's the tragedy.
Yeah. So so the parent who has a 14 or 15-year-old child, male or female, and from what I'm reading at the moment, it seems to me as though there's a predominance of females, presently in Australia doing this thing, probably something like between 3 and 5 to 1. What does the wise Christian parent say to their teenager if they're having some uncertainties about about their gender?
And I'm not a counsellor. I'm not a pastor. So my advice is limited. I think it's a terribly difficult situation for parents to be in. But I think that above all, it's a question of encouraging their kids to hang lightly to it and realizing that they shouldn't be making irreversible changes. I don't think it's wise at all to go along with changing names, using her rather than him, or him rather than her. I think that's very unwise, because that's the beginning of a pathway from which they may never recover. Now, does that mean that you're then in serious conflict with your teenage child? Yes, you may well be. But let's be honest, parents are often in serious conflict with their teenage children about a lot of things, about alcohol, about staying out late at night, and so on. It's part of the pathway of parenthood. I wish God had made children that they sort of go from 12 to 20 and skip the teenage years, but unfortunately, that's not how we are made. And so, yes, it's a terribly distressing situation, but I would do what I could to maintain that relationship, at the same time being firm about the fact that to do anything on the basis of these beliefs could be life-changing in an adverse way. And there is no, just on a non-binary issue, Andrew, there is no physical manifestation of what it means to be non-binary. I understand what is the physical manifestation of trying to be as close as you can to being male, or the physical manifestation of being close as you can to looking like a female. But there is no physical manifestation of what it means to be non-binary. And so any teenager who's saying, I want to change my body to become non-binary, is trying to change the body to something which has never existed in human history.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, okay, so just thinking about some possible questions for you from our viewers, Patrick. Peter, do you have any questions coming in from our viewers at the moment?
Yes, I do, Andrew, and thank you, Professor Parkinson. That's been very informative. I've got one here that I'd like to comment on. I've heard that psychologists and doctors can be jailed for attempting to help children by explaining that their condition could resolve as they reach maturity, but are prohibited from doing so. Have you got a comment on that, Professor Parkinson?
Yes, this is another of the rather insidious aspects of the transgender movement, that in 3 jurisdictions so far that I know of, there may be more now, there are laws against what's called conversion therapy. Now, conversion therapy is very broadly defined as any conduct to change or suppress the sexual orientation or gender identity of someone. Now, the worst of these laws are in Victoria. It probably doesn't surprise anybody who is listening. And the worst case scenario is up to 10 years jail for doing this, and parents who take their children to a therapist, even interstate, could be charged with an offence as well. Now, the reassuring thing to say is that it's extremely unlikely that this will actually occur. In order to convict somebody of an offence under even Victoria's conversion therapy laws, there's a lot that the government would have to prove. And I think in most cases it won't be able to prove that. So it's not so much the criminal law that I'd be worried about in Victoria, though in the ACT, for example, I would have concerns about that. It's the medical regulation agencies like APRA, it's the Equal Opportunity Human Rights Commission in Victoria, which has an oversight of these things and can deal with complaints. That's the sort of harassment that I expect psychologists will experience if they engage in therapy, which is helping kids to try to explore why they're feeling as they do. And there's an irony, Andrew, in all of this, and that is that in Victoria now, very troubled teenagers who have gender confusion issues, gender identity issues, and other mental health concerns are being turned away by psychologists and psychiatrists who don't want a bar of it because they are scared of these laws. And so that's going to increase suicides. It's going to increase mental health problems for these young people who won't get the help that they need. Now, in Queensland, we were able to get changes to the law that make the conversion therapy law much less severe. Psychologists and other medical practitioners who reasonably believe that they are doing something which is medically appropriate in the best interest of the patient will be protected under the law. But the law is far from clear. And again, it has what we call a chilling effect. You know, you don't know exactly what the law says. You know, you won't accept the patient. You won't accept the client because you're worried about complaints to professional organizations or the police knocking at the door. And that's very understandable.
Thank you, Professor Parkinson. Could you tell us a bit more about the health problems that these people might encounter if they start going down the track of medication and surgery?
So we're getting to some complex issues, and I have to be quite specific. Let me start off with boys first of all. Boys who go on puberty blockers, essentially, because that's often the first stage, you stop puberty at age 10, 11 years old. What will happen is that boy will grow up into adulthood with a boy's penis, with a boy's testes, with a prepubertal body, without having gone through all the changes of puberty. And that obviously, if you interrupt puberty in that way, you're interrupting, whether it's a boy or girl, fundamental developmental stages of human life. We don't know the effects on the brain, but we have some indications that it could be very harmful to the brain. Now, for girls who go on puberty blockers, if they continue long enough, they will experience a shriveling of their genitalia in their lower regions. They will not develop, their eggs will not develop, so they can't have children. And for both boys and girls, there are significant effects on bone density. Bone density naturally increases as you go through puberty. And if you stop puberty, then what happens is that you become extremely vulnerable to osteoporosis and to fractures of the bones because your bones have not developed in a normal way. Now, some of this catches up if they then go on cross-sex hormones, but then those bring other problems, cardiac problems, problems with sexual function. Girls who go on puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones will not experience normal sexual functioning as females, but they won't experience them as males either because they are not males. Boys who go on these drugs will not experience the capacity to orgasm. There's not a single boy who's gone through that pathway of cross-sex hormones and through to, puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones who has experienced an orgasm, according to one of America's leading experts. So we're destroying sexual function, and we're destroying fertility along the way, amongst other problems as well.
Thank you again, Professor. I have a question here. How can we get politicians to take transgender problems seriously and get their party to fight for women's rights in sport, toilets, jails, etc., in legislation, and stop supporting the LGBTIQ events because it's trendy in a desperate attempt to gain votes?
I think it is incredibly important that local constituency MPs hear regularly and strongly from members of the community. So many ideas just get traction within political parties because they're listening to 0.0001% of the population. And these are activists who will push them in a certain direction, and they'll be ideologically committed to it. But you need to be talking to your local MP, and if you're in a federal constituency, to your senators in your state as well, about these issues and say how concerned you are. And the issue of women's rights is absolutely front and center to all of this. Your daughters will be changing with men in public swimming pool changing rooms, in your schools, and so on and so forth, if we do not oppose these changes.
Yes. Another question, Professor Parkinson. Is it highly unlikely that gender transition, so-called, will be ever able to alter the X and Y chromosome patterns of the transitioning person's body tissue?
It's impossible to alter it. It's impossible.
Yes.
So all you can do is change external genitalia. I suppose a female can have a hysterectomy that brings on premature menopause, for a young woman in her 20s to go through menopause. Think about that. You can make those surgical modifications, but you cannot change your genetic makeup. And your body will forever be fighting against the changes you have made, because it is not natural for girls to have testosterone. It's not natural for males to have estrogen in the quantities, obviously, that they are being prescribed. And so the body is going to fight against it. The body is going to fight against the surgery. It has a wound. It has a wound, which it is. We are made not to just accept that wound. And so for the rest of their lives, these people will be on medication, and heavy medication at that.
Thank you, Professor. Is it a good idea to refer a confused child to real life examples like Kira Bell with her regret?
Yes, I think it is. And it's not just Kira Bell, Peter. It's so many. If you go online, do it for this reason, and look up detransitioners. You'll find them on Twitter. You'll find them on YouTube. There are tragic stories, largely teenage girls who are now young adults who have made irreversible changes. Young women who will never be able to bear children. Young women who, even if they did bear children, couldn't breastfeed their children. These are lifelong tragic consequences. And while, in fairness, a lot of people who go through these medical procedures do go on and are comfortable with what they have done, and it caused you a real crisis if you weren't comfortable with what you've done. There's enough people who are regretting it to cause us to say this is a real problem.
Thank you again. Could you tell us a bit about the autism side of things and how that seems to be feeding into the problem?
We don't know fully, Peter, why it's feeding into the problem. What we do know is in every study tells you the same thing. Autistic kids or kids with Asperger's are grossly overrepresented amongst the kids who are going to gender clinics and with adults as well. Now, one of the features of autism is that you do tend to obsess about things. If you have an autistic child, they'll just go all in, obsessing about a particular issue. If they've been taught in their schools that you could be a girl when you're a boy, or you could be a boy when you're a girl, and they obsess about those things, you can see how that can become embedded in their psyche. And they may then, want their parents to take them to the doctor and to go on puberty blockers or whatever. So that's a possible explanation for this. And the other thing I'd say about autism is this: autistic kids do tend to find it more difficult to engage in social communication. They may be quite lonely. They may be, not very popular at school. They may have difficulty in the playground, all these things. And if a magic solution comes that I can become popular and special and accepted and unique, by doing something, that can be a pathway to popularity that an autistic kid might want to seek more than perhaps other kids. So those are two possible explanations of what is going on.
Yeah, thank you again. Professor, could you tell us a bit about the Tavistock Institute in England and what happened there with the situation?
Yes. What's happening in England is encouraging from my point of view, because the government is now recognizing that this gender affirmation approach has got serious risks and problems to it. Women's groups are now making a lot of headway in saying, hey, what about our rights? And a lot of the gender ideology is just collapsing like a pack of cards in the UK at the moment. Now, in terms of the Tavistock, Tavistock is the only clinic in England and Wales to which kids can be referred in the National Health Service. They could go to a private doctor, but if they're in the National Health Service, the Tavistock was the only place. Based in London, but also a branch in Leeds as well. And they saw all these kids. Now, a lot of the Tavistock practice was actually very responsible. You wouldn't have heard that from the media necessarily, but actually there were some clinicians who were, very concerned to explore all the reasons why kids were coming to them. And there's a research study of 12 patients at the Tavistock who came wanting cross-sex hormones and going to go down this pathway and left after counseling, having resolved these issues and realizing that that was not the answer for them. So there were some clinicians at the Tavistock who really were trying to be very responsible about not promoting this pathway of medication quickly or easily at all. But there were others who took a rather ideological approach of gender affirmation, of saying, well, as long as for 6 months or more this kid has been saying that I'm a boy or I'm a girl, they should go down the medical pathway. And the real concern was that they weren't properly investigating the mental health issues. And the government last year appointed a very eminent paediatrician called Hilary Cass to investigate all these issues. And she came up essentially with the recommendation that Tavistock be closed. Now, in some ways it will be expanded because now regional hospitals will deal with all these cases, but they'll do so through a mental health lens. They'll do so with the psychiatrists and psychologists seeing this primarily as a mental health issue, which needs to be addressed. In Sweden and in Finland, they pretty much stopped this puberty blocker and cross-sex hormone pathway entirely. And I think England will go the same way. So that's what the Tavistock case is all about. In Australia, they're saying, oh, we never acted like the Tavistock. Well, no, a lot of the practice in Australia is much worse, much more irresponsible than the Tavistock. And that is something our politicians do not realize.
Thank you, Professor. I've got one comment that you might wish to comment on. It says, the parental pain is very real. It feels like an impossible situation.
Yeah. The mental pain must be absolutely terrible. Terrible. And I've known people who have that pain. I can only sympathize. It really is an awfully difficult situation to be in. And if you have a faith in God, you pray that God will help you and your child through it all, not knowing what the future might look like. That's the dilemma for a lot of parents.
Thank you, Professor. I do have one other question. What is a good article or written journal paper or book with references and evidences backing up the proposition about the whole transgender issue? So do you have something you could recommend for our audience?
Yes, there's two books. Abigail Schreier, Irreversible Damage. She's a journalist in the United States. She's written for, I think, the Washington Post and other, or the Wall Street Journal. Very eminent journalist. She did a brilliant job of bringing together the stories around girls. So it's particularly around girls and talking to parents, talking to kids. And it's called Irreversible Damage. The other book is by an English journalist called Helen Joyce. It's called Trans. And it's a brilliantly researched book. Helen Joyce was a writer for The Economist. Again, very, very highly educated and experienced journalist, and she has done a fantastic job of explaining all these issues. So Helen Joyce, Trans, and Abigail Schreier, Irreversible Damage. Those are the two books I would recommend.
Thank you, Professor. That's all that I had.
So just thinking about this issue as we come to a conclusion, Patrick, it seems to me as a husband and father, and now as a grandfather, that we can deal with these things in the family in terms of having, well, one key will be being close to your child, so that they grow up knowing that dad and mum are available for conversation. Not everything that they say dad and mum may agree with, but if dad and mum are available for their opinion, and the child has learnt that dad and mum are generally pretty right in what they suggest to them, then the child is less inclined to be influenced by ridiculous ideas they're hearing in social media. They think, well, that's just ridiculous. Whereas if the child over years or time has become indifferent towards parents and towards dad and mum's opinions and views and outlook, then they're going to be more predisposed to be listening to what we would kindly call rather odd views and values, do you think?
Well, we know some teenagers don't listen to parents at all.
Yep.
But let me frame this in a different way. The closer you are to your child and the more important you are to your child, the more the child will not want to risk losing you.
Right.
And so in this very difficult situation of them pushing against the boundaries, wanting to be taken to a doctor, wanting to go on puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones, saying this with the answer to their problems. If you are close to your child and they know that the only way that they're going to do this may be by leaving home and finding, alternative accommodation and so on, and they risk losing the most important people in their lives, that might be a real barrier for them from pushing the boundaries right to the edge. And I think that's the importance of trying to remain close to your child through all these difficult issues. They know who you are, if you are important to them. And dads, if your child knows and has a sense of how important you are to her or him, then I think that is protective against them going off the edge, as it were, making the most dangerous decisions at an age when they are not ready to do so.
Great. Well, thank you, Patrick, for your contributions today and your expertise in this difficult zone of transgender. And we thank you again, and trust you have a good afternoon today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Peter.